Thanks for coming today. As I mentioned to you, today we have a guest, Mr. Jerry Wisler. He has a lot in common with you. In addition to being an alum from the program, he's touched a lot of the different things that we've all touched as pharmacists and pharmacy students. A number of different medications that you're aware of and have used many times are part of the portfolio that he's worked with. So I am going to let him talk to you a little bit about what he does. Let's pay attention here for Mr. Jerry Wisler.
Thanks. So I was here about, I guess, a year and a half ago, Jeff, is that what it was? And I talked to another glass, and I guess I didn't suck too bad, so they invited me back. I actually probably think this is more fun for me than probably for you guys, but it's a nice way to get back. I sat in those chairs, I guess, 35 years ago or 34 years ago, so it goes by in a blink of an eye. But most of that time I've been in the, can everybody hear me? Or do I need to shout louder? Most of that time I've been in the pharmaceutical industry, which for me worked out great. I thought that was a great experience for me. So I graduated in '79 from the College of Pharmacy, and then worked for a little bit as a pharmacist, and then went back and got an MBA while I was working as a pharmacist. And about 2/3 of the way through an MBA, I was asked to join Merck, and I did, which proved to be one of the great decisions I've ever made beyond that, plus my wife. And you know, here I am 30 years later, after a fairly solid career in the pharmaceutical industry. I was with Merck for 20 years, and then I started two companies. Both ended up being successful companies, which is, it's rare to have one successful company, and to have two successful companies is extremely rare. I'm actually looking forward to next May. The second company I started is a company called Alumnus, and we were developing really high potency, better than Leveza prescription fish oil. And next May, assuming that that drug gets approved by the FDA, I think I'll be one of a handful, if not the only person, to start two companies, both of products get approved by the FDA. So that will be rare air. So we'll see. I don't know if anybody else has done that. I know people who started one company and had multiple products get approved by the FDA, but I don't know anybody's tried it twice. Usually we're not stupid enough to try it twice. And now somebody's asking me to try it a third time, so I haven't decided on that one yet. But you know, like you, I really didn't have a strong clue of what I was going to be doing, and certainly, you know, looking back 35 years ago, I had no idea what I was going to be doing throughout the rest of my career. I thought I'd be a pharmacist, primarily a retail pharmacist. There was a drug chain in Toledo called Lane's, and you know, I always thought I'd go to Lane's. There was a guy over there who was a bit of a mentor of mine, and I always thought I would just take over for him as director of pharmacy, and it'd be a pretty good life. And then Dean Billups, when he was here, actually introduced me to Merck, and as they say many times, the rest is history. Merck was, as I said earlier, you know, one of the great decisions I made, because I found something I really was passionate about. I liked the profession of pharmacy a lot, but you know, it really was within the pharmaceutical industry that I really found something that was home to me. But one of the great parts about getting a pharmacy degree is there's a lot of things you can do with it. You can be hospital pharmacy, you can be retail pharmacy, you can be compound, you can be consulting. If I just look at, you know, people from my class, what they went on and did, it was a myriad of activities. Somebody was involved in radio pharmacy. A number of us joined the industry, and even within the industry, you know, there's quality control, there's pharmaceutical manufacturing, there's compounding or product development, and then I was on the commercial side most of my career. You know, you'd interact with pharmacists all the time, and then, you know, from once I started companies, I started interacting with the Wall Street crowd more, and there were, you know, a number of people I met along the way on Wall Street that had pharmacy backgrounds. Some were analysts, so looking at evaluating drugs to see whether or not that company had a chance of success. You know, some had other jobs on the Wall Street side. All of that is, you know, extremely interesting, but you have to follow, you know, sort of what you want to do. And that's sort of my, you know, first key of success, was really sort of figuring out what you want to do. So I'll walk through this, I guess, a little bit, and then this one is what I moved to? Yes. Let's see if it works. So I think the key, I mean, I've got a daughter who's 22, so about your age, and just graduated from college. She's hanging out in India for 6 months now. But when she gets back, I keep on encouraging her to just experiment with different jobs. Because you really don't know until you've done it whether or not you're going to like it. And then there's always a chance, especially with your degrees, to go off and do something different, as I did, by joining the pharmaceutical industry. When I joined Merck, my dad said it was the dumbest decision I've ever made. And that's saying a lot, because I made a lot of dumb decisions in my life. It turned out to be, as I said, probably the greatest decision I ever made other than marrying my wife. And sometimes you just got to take a leap of faith in that. But it really comes down to knowing yourself. For me, the pharmaceutical industry made a lot of sense. For you, some other aspects of pharmacy may make a lot of sense, or you may ultimately choose you want to go back and become a physician, or my roommate in college, went off and became a dentist. So there are a lot of things available to you, and I would encourage you to always, focus on following your passion or following something you're going to be interested in. I really like the marketing aspects, and one of the things I'll talk a little bit about is, what it means to be a marketer today. I'll talk a little bit about what it means to be an entrepreneur today. You can make a lot of money being an entrepreneur, or you can fail miserably. So fortunately, I followed the former path as opposed to the latter. But it really comes down to knowing what you're comfortable with. Probably the most uncomfortable I ever got was the day I decided to leave Merck and go off and do something different. And then I went to Novartis, so another big company, and realized Novartis was worse at the things that I was doing than the reason I left Merck. So then I had the opportunity to start a company, and that's, I enjoyed that as much as I enjoyed my Merck days. But all along the way, I talked to a lot of people within Merck, and I continued to talk to people at the college. As I mentioned, Dean Billups was the first guy who got me into Merck. Doc Schlimbach has been a long-term friend of mine. He used to play hooky. I thought it was me playing hooky, but he would play hooky from his assistant dean days almost every Friday afternoon. We'd go out and play some golf. Now that he's retired, I can say that comfortably. Only his admin knew at the time. But you do really have to find, your own way. But leaving Merck was uncomfortable, and even, as our last company, Amthera, got bought out by AstraZeneca in the summer, and the day the deal was closing, I was having lunch with a former colleague from Merck, and he was saying, do you ever regret, or did you ever regret the decision to leave Merck? And I said, I still regret the decision to leave Merck, because I loved Merck. Every aspect of Merck was great from my perspective, and especially in those days. I joined Merck in '83, went up to the home office in '86 and never left. And from '86 to 1993, Merck was the most admired corporation in America. Not the most admired pharmaceutical company, but the most admired corporation in America. 7 years in a row, and no other corporation before or since has done that. Apple's getting close with 6 years in a row. Based upon what they've done over the last year and a half, I don't think they'll hit number 7. But Merck was as cool as Apple was to any investor, and it allowed you a chance to develop very rapidly, because we were growing so rapidly. I was telling Jeff before I came in, the first 5 years I was up at the home office, I had 6 different jobs. So you're getting a new job and advancing, every 10 or 12 months. And then things slowed down a little bit, mostly because I was getting into fairly senior positions. But within 5 years of joining the home office, I was in fairly senior positions within Merck. And in 1991, I was running a product called Tomoptic, and I was running all of ophthalmics for Merck. But Tomoptic in 1991 was the 4th largest product for Merck, at $140 million a year in revenues. The largest product at Merck at the time was Mefoxen, and it was doing about $250, $300 million a year. 10 years later, in 2001, I was running the atherosclerosis franchise for Merck, so Zocor and Zocor, and involved in Zetia and Vytorin. And in 1991, Zocor did $4.4 billion in the U.S. So you go from $300 million a year being the largest product to $4.4 billion a year as the largest product. So imagine the growth curve that Merck was on during that time period. And that's really sort of about the time Merck peaked. Stock price, I think, in 2000 was $95 a share, and last I looked, it was in the mid to upper 40s. So, you know, over time, you know, companies grow and they fail a little bit, and Merck's on a downward trend, and you may have noticed in the last week or so, they announced they're laying off another 8,500 positions over the next 2 years. So Merck's on its downturn, but even back when I left Merck 10 years ago, you could begin to see that was going to happen. You know, we were losing some big products, including, you know, Zocor. Zocor was going off patent in 2006. And I remember having a conversation with the CEO in 2001, you know, talking about the importance of addressing the patent expiry of Zocor in June of 2006. And he's like, well, we'll get through it. We've always gotten through it. And I was like, Ray, Zocor is big as your next 4 products combined. You know, so to make up for that hole in 2006, all those 4 products, which at that point in time were going to be very old products, would have to double in revenues. It's just not going to happen. You got to start preparing today for what eventually was going to happen. One of those products was Vioxx. So Vioxx failed in 2004, I guess, was taken off the market. And that's why Merck's where it's at. The industry, you know, back when I was in school here, Lilly was the premier pharmaceutical company. And it's, you know, probably 10th in size now. In 1993, we were talking about Merck becoming so big when we acquired Medco, and I was involved in that business decision, that Merck would be so big that it would trigger, the acquisition of Medco would trigger antitrust regulation, because Merck was 9.3% of the entire pharmaceutical industry in 1993. Now it's probably 3%. So things have changed. Merck's still a great company, but not nearly like it was. And part of my decision to leave Merck was sort of the know thyself. I was having lunch with Dean Early and a few others. And I was talking, you know, one of the biggest reasons is I sort of ran out of things that interested me to do at Merck. I was running the biggest franchise, and, you know, I became very good friends with the President of the U.S., and he and I were talking, and I said, well, I'm not really sure what I want to do next. And he's like, well, I'd like to see you do my job. And I said, well, the problem with that, David, is every night, you know, I see you walking out of here with 2 briefcases full of work. And I've got, you know, a son that's 4 and a daughter that's 9, and I'm just not going to do that. So there is a point in time, but every time you advance in a career like that, you give up a little bit of yourself. And you have to decide at what point in time is enough. I was telling my brother yesterday, it was a interim CEO job I was being asked to do for a while, and it was offering me a lot of money, you know, $100,000 a month to do this job. But it was, you know, flying all the time and traveling out to California, and I was like, yeah, that's enough. I'm not going to do it, so I didn't do it. So you reach a point in time where you can turn down that kind of money. It's a good thing to have, but you do have to know what you're willing to do and what you're not willing to do. And I'm not willing to put up with the kind of crap that, even if I can make $100,000 a month to do it. And that was the same thing in the U.S. When I, you know, said I didn't want to do the president job, I'd go off and try to do something different. And that path worked out pretty well. A guy who reported to me when I was running Pepsi, and I mentored for a long time at Merck, is now heir apparent at Merck as CEO. And he and I had dinner about a year ago. And I told him, I said, part of me always wonders whether or not I made the right decision by, you know, leaving Merck and getting off the merry-go-round to advance up to where Adam has now advanced. And I still think I've made the right decision, but when you get named CEO, it's going to come back and say, boy, that could have been me. You know, whether I would have beat Adam or not remains to be seen, but I took myself out of the running. And Adam came to me and he said, you know, I've watched what you've done, you know, starting 2 companies and advancing, and he goes, part of me wishes I would have done what you've done. You know, but I never had the guts to go off and start my own company. I was always more comfortable within the Merck environment. So you really do have to know yourself and understand what's going to be comfortable for you and not comfortable for me. Starting 2 companies for most people would be very uncomfortable. For me, it was way more comfortable than walking out the door with 2 briefcases every night and flying all over the world like Adam does today. The other piece is hard work. It takes a lot of effort to be successful. And again, you have to understand what you're willing to do and what you're not willing to do. And as I said, I didn't want to walk out, doing work until midnight every night and not seeing my kids. But I could have. But there is an amount of work that it becomes a threshold where it's just not worth doing it anymore. But in order to be successful, you've got to work hard. As I said, I'm thinking about starting another company, and the scientists I'm talking to, I'm like, look, this is a lot of work. There was when Steve Jobs died 2 years ago, there was this clip that came out about him talking about when he started Next. He started Apple, and then he was dismissed from Apple and started Next. And there was this clip, he said, boy, I forgot how hard it was to start a company. You got to do human resources, you got to do all the infrastructure, you got to raise capital, you got to do all these things. And once you've done it and you sort of get past, it's like giving birth. Once you sort of get past it, it seems good. But then you go back and do it again, you become pregnant again, and you're thinking about giving birth again. It's a lot of work, and you start saying, boy, I'm not sure it was worth it. And then as you may know, or certainly will know, the first couple of years of having a kid is a little bit rough. It's a lot of work to have a kid the first couple of years. There's a name that you'll maybe recognize, Bubba Watson. Bubba's a professional golfer. Bubba lives in the development that we live in, and I was having lunch with Bubba a week and a half ago. And he's like, we're thinking about adopting again. His first child was adopted. And he was dead serious. He goes, I think I want to adopt a 4-year-old. His son is 19 months. He goes, I'm trying to convince Angie to adopt a 4-year-old, because the first couple of years they don't remember anything anyway. It's just a lot of work. But it does require a lot of work to be successful, whether it's successful within Merck or successful in anything you do. And so you have to understand that as you're getting into it. The biggest thing, I think, beyond these two for our criteria is really having a strategic vision and where you want to go. In the venture capital world, the last statistic I heard is only 1 out of every 170 ideas presented to venture capital ever get funded. So people naively think that venture capital just throws a lot of money all over the place. And the ones that hit, they make a lot of money on, and the ones that miss, they just write off. But that's not the case at all. When I started Agerian was like the hardest thing to start because it was a drug that was abandoned by Bristol Myers Squibb. And they abandoned it for safety concerns, and my vision of why that drug failed is they just overdosed it. And part of that came from my Merck experience. People think about Mevacor being the first statin, but it actually wasn't. The first statin was this drug that Sankyo was developing called Compactin. And even today, most lipid experts don't even know Compactin because it was abandoned at the last minute because of safety concerns. And when they went back and looked at it, it was because they were overdosing it. And Merck sort of figured it out, and took the risk that they just missed the boat with Sankyo, and Mevacor became a billion-dollar drug, and then ultimately, Lipitor became a $13 billion a year drug, I think. But that whole market, which was by far the largest market ever in the pharmaceutical industry, could have all failed because somebody could have gone down the path that they're just not safe. So it really did take a strategic vision for Merck to go off and develop Mevacor and the rest of the statins. And to a large extent, I didn't think 50 or 75 milligrams the dose that Bristol was developing lamidipine at was the right dose, except for people with severe cholesterol. And so, sort of like, let's back this off, let's titrate them up, let's get them used to it. And now Agerian's worth $2.5 billion. So an abandoned drug turned into a company that's worth $2.6 billion, I think was the market cap yesterday. Unfortunately, I sold my stock at $700 million or whatever, so even I make a lot of bad decisions. But strategic vision is there, and then the same thing with Umthera. You really did have to have a view of how to develop this drug and what were the aspects of it. And we started Umthera in 2009, which I can tell you was the worst possible time to start a company, given the economic meltdown that was going on. But I believed in the drug, and the guy who I co-formed the company with was a believer in the drug and one of the premier lipid experts in the world, and we formed a company, and we sold it to AstraZeneca a couple months ago for $400 million. So if you're right in the right division, it can go a long way. And then it's luck, you know. I mean, I happen to, you know, somebody tried to recruit me out of work to go to this company called Aspirion, and Aspirion got acquired a couple years later by Pfizer for $1.3 billion. But I never believed in the Aspirion drug, so I didn't join Aspirion. He wanted me to be CEO of Aspirion. And to me, the drug never made sense. Pfizer bought the company for $1.3 billion, so from an economic perspective, you know, that would have made a lot of sense. But then the drug failed, and Pfizer sold the company back for $5 million. So that was a bad investment, $1.3 billion down to $5 million. They sold it back to Roger, who started Aspirion in the first place, and then some other assets. But it was that chance meeting that, you know, caused him to come to me with the Agerian compound and say, "What do you think?" And you know, I developed a strategy, and you know, we went off and started Agerian, and then, like I say, it was a little bit lucky. We took a good path that I think was found by strong strategic vision, but I certainly will say there was a fair amount of luck in Agerian, and there was a lot of times that we were running on fumes, almost out of money. At the last minute, we'd raise a little bit more money. So that company could have failed in a number of different ways. So, you know, from a marketer's perspective, and I still think of myself as a marketer. You know, I'd write it on my passport as I was going into other countries, but then they would reject me because nobody really likes a marketer. But I freely admit I'm a marketer. And marketing really is all, and so many things, is all about strategic vision. And I think strategy is, how much time do we have today anyway, brother?
You got about a half hour left.
Okay. Strategy, I think, is like a chessboard. So there used to be this great movie that I would highly recommend you see. It's probably on Netflix or something, called In Search for Bobby Fischer. Bobby Fischer was one of the great chess geniuses of all time. Or somebody or other, Bobby Fischer was these great geniuses. And in this movie, it's really talking about this child prodigy in chess. He was probably 10 or 12 years old. And he was being trained by a chess master. And I think there's different orders of magnitude of chess master, like there are different orders of black belts in karate or taekwondo or whatever. And he was saying, in order to be a chess master, you have to think forward, you know, 7 moves. You have to understand where the board is going to go and where your competitor is going to go for the next 7 moves. And I always likened that to any kind of strategic vision. You really had to understand where you're going to go. It's not just the next move. And then you have to understand that if you make a mistake, you know, in chess you could move the bishop back or the knight back to where it was before, but by that time the board has changed. So I'll give you, and it's also execution as well, which is sort of the next piece. But you know, strategy and execution go hand in hand. And you really have to look at the dynamic and say, okay, what is likely going to be successful? So I was running Pepsid in 93 to 95 for Merck. And there was a friend of mine who left Merck and joined Glaxo. He was heading up their franchise, which was Zantac. And I knew George very well. George was a good friend of mine, and I knew him very well. And I knew his strengths and I knew his weaknesses. He was product manager for launch at Mevacor, and that was, to this day, the best marketing plan I've ever read. It was just very well laid out, but he had, you know, 24 months to think about it and, you know, prepare for the execution. I was always a little bit better at being in the dogfight. So again, sort of know yourself. And so I was good at responding to sort of on-the-fly competitive situations. Whereas George was terrible at that. George was the worst I'd ever seen. If he was forced to make a decision, even under a gun to his head, it would take him a week. He just couldn't make a decision. Where I could make a decision and live with it, which is really good from an entrepreneur's perspective, because you've got to make a lot of decisions. You've got to make them quickly. But in that situation, you know, when George announced he was going to Glaxo and he said he was going to Zantac, I pulled my product managers together and said, okay, here's the game plan. Here's the one strategy we've got in mind, but we've got to bury it amongst all these other things. And it's got to be the 3rd or 4th thing we put out there. And so George will see the first thing and he'll say, what the hell are they up to? And he'll start analyzing that. And, you know, it'll take him a month or 2 months and he'll figure it out and he'll try to see what we're doing. And before he gets to that point in time where he's figured it out, we've got to have the second thing go out. And George will clear the table and do it all over again. And so he'll analyze everything with this 2 thing. So then the 3rd thing we come out is the golden nugget, the thing we really want to do. And by this time, George will be flabbergasted. It'll take him 4 or 5 months to make a decision. And that's exactly how it played out. We put the first thing out, George was looking at it, because I talked to people at Glaxo after the fact. And the second thing out, George was looking at it. The third thing out was our golden nugget, and he didn't respond for a year. And by that time, we took over the hospital market with Pepsi. So you've got to have this vision, but you can't go back on it. When I took over Zocor in '97, it was 9 months or so after Lipitor had launched. And in the shortest period ever, a product that was market leader lost market leadership. Lipitor took over Zocor in about 9 months. So I was asked by David, the president, to go in and take over the franchise. And he's like, next year to make plan, we got to grow 3 share points. And I'm like, David, Zocor's in a death spiral. I mean, we'd be lucky to hold on to the shares that we've got, but I'm going to miss plan next year because I took it over in December. I'm going to miss plan next year, but every year after that, I'll make plan. But you got to give me some time to, pull it out of, turn the Titanic around and pull it out of this death spiral. And we did. We in 4 of the 5 years that I ran Zocor, we hit new $1 billion sales milestones. So we passed 2 the first year I was there, and then 2 years later we passed 3, and then we passed 4, and then we passed 5, which again is pretty rare in the industry to have that kind of a growth. But it really comes down to, you look at what Zocor was doing. Zocor was, changing strategy every 3 or 4 months. During that 9-month period of time, they were changing strategy multiple times, and they thought this would work and it wasn't working, and part of it was they just never had enough time to think about what they needed to do. And then, unfortunately, that was a classic example of too many cooks, all the way up to the CEO. So I went in, and the CEO was talking to me, and he had one idea, one went wrong, and the head of research, who was a genius, but only in research, told me what he thought went wrong, and David told me what he thought went wrong, and I'm like, look, the only reason I'm going to do this is you got to give me autonomy to figure out what I think is going wrong. So I made these moves that turned out to be the right moves, but it was contrary to what Ray Gilmartin wanted to do, who was CEO, and Ned Skolnick wanted to do, who was head of research, and what David wanted to do, who was head of US. And God knows how I kept my job. But I did it, and then a couple years later I was talking at the Wharton MBA program. And I was talking through, the decision-making process and how I just did things. And part of the best quote I ever heard was, it's easier to ask for forgiveness than to ask for permission. I applied that to Zocor, because if I would have waited for consensus, I already had 3 opposing views of very senior people. So if I would have waited for consensus of what we needed to do, we would have never made a decision. So I just acted, and it worked out. And we ended up hitting the kind of milestones and actually regrowing share in the last couple of years I was in charge of it. But you've got to have a strategic vision, and then we never went off the strategic vision. So at the time, the biggest mistake that Merck made is that Zocor start dose was 10 milligrams. Even 3 years after the fact that Merck did the largest clinical study, the outcome study with statin, which is called 4S, at Zocor 20 milligrams was the start dose, and 37% of the people titrated up to 40. So why you're promoting this outcomes benefit at a suboptimal dose made no sense at all. And so within 6 months, we got the 20 milligram dose approved as a start dose. We got an 80 milligram dose approved, which now has been taken off the market. And then, along the way, you got to have a little bit of fun. So once we started gaining some traction and stabilizing share, then it was time to, get back at the Pfizer guys. I never liked Pfizer. Seemed like most of my career, I was always fighting with the big guy, either Glaxo for Zantac or Pfizer for Lipitor. And a buddy of mine eventually became president of the U.S. in Bristol, and they had Pravachol, and I was like, look, Rick, I'm not even thinking about you. I'm just focused on Lipitor, so you go off and do what you want to do. So there were things that I did just to piss Pfizer off. So there was one time, there was an American Heart Association meeting in Dallas, right? So when you've got these big conventions, everybody goes in, and so I hired this mole to go out and figure out where Pfizer is going to stay. And because Merck had cut resources behind Zocor. So I found out where Pfizer was going to stay, where they put all their top executives in. And I bought an exclusive on all the hotel room keys. So they could only give out Zocor room keys. So no matter how much Pfizer protested, I had a contractual obligation with the hotel that the Zocor, logo was going to be on their room key. And then to really piss them off, the next day I bought the front cover of the USA Today. And USA Today is in all these newspapers, or all these hotel rooms. And I bought the front cover of USA Today with the Zocor advertisement. So all of them woke up the next day after getting their room key and seeing a USA Today. So you got to have a little bit of fun along the way. And you could tell the Pfizer people just walking around the convention because they all looked pissed off. And then we launched this Get the Goal guarantee. And you have to remember what worked well for people in the past. When you think about the U.S. automobile industry, when you guys were just babies, so you're not thinking about it too much, but same thing now. Ford and GM and Chrysler were having real issues in the early to mid 90s. And the Japanese car companies were much better, and the Germans were better as well. And you'd buy a Ford, and or a GM or something, and it'd break after a couple of years. I mean, you'd never get to 50,000 miles. But they made a bold step, and they offered warranties, 5-year, 7-year warranties. Because the worst case is you buy a Ford, and you say, well, if it craps out, they got to fix it. And so that's what we did. We did get the gold guarantee for Zocor, knowing that everybody could really get the gold on Zocor. 98% of the people could get the gold on Zocor, but people didn't believe it. So you put a guarantee out there and said, look, if it doesn't work, if it doesn't get people to gold, we'll give the patient their money back. And that all came from looking to see what Ford and Chrysler did to change their, in their case, reliability image. I just changed the efficacy image for Zocor overnight by offering a guarantee. And there was only 2 people we ever paid out by doing it. But you do have to think about, consciously think about using money well. When I was running ophthalmics in the early 90s, the CEO at the time was a guy by the name of Roy Badgers, who was just a genius, best CEO ever, which is why Merck was most admired corporation in America. The only problem was Roy's mom was on Tomoptic. So if there was ever a complaint about Tomoptic, he heard about it. And then, of course, I heard about it. So in 1990, there were 143 patient complaints on Tomoptic. And no matter how much I tried to convince Roy that it was because Tomoptic was a dispenser, and how many complaints are you going to get on a tablet? But it was a dispenser, and people would stick the dispenser too close to their eye, and they would suck up a little bit of the liquid, and it would clog the tip, and then the bottle wouldn't work, and they would write in a complaint to Merck. So Merck was spending millions and millions of dollars trying to come up with other dispenser things. They came up with this thing that looked like, straight out of some horror movie, that you would put it on your eye, and then you would push it, and it would dispense a drop, and it would keep it away from your eye. And that thing cost Merck $2 million. And I go into a meeting, because I'm, as my wife would tell you, I'm too logical of a person sometimes. But I go into this meeting, and I'm like, here's my solution, And like, anyone complains, they get a year's supply of Tomoptic for free, and we send them down to Disney World for 2 weeks, and just make them happy. And I've done the math. That whole thing would cost us about $300,000. We're spending $2 billion a year just on this research that we're doing that's not going to pan out. They didn't buy into that, but at least I got them to think about, gee, these complaints, we're just making way too big of a deal of it. $2 million a year for 143 complaints. I mean, do the math. It's an outrageous amount of money. But strategy is, critical in marketing. You really have to have a vision. If you look at Apple versus Microsoft, 2 very different paths. Or if anybody's seen the movie Rush, it was out this week. It's a great movie, so I recommend it. You had Niki Lauda, who was a strategist and really sort of a strict guy, and then you had James Hunt, who was just a playboy and was always drinking and womanizing and doing drugs. And they were both successful. One year, Niki Lauda won the championship, and the next year James Hunt won the championship. They're 2 very different paths. You can have different strategies without knowing which is going to work or which isn't going to work. But you've got to stick with your path and stick with what works for you. So if you look at Apple versus Microsoft developing the operating system and just licensing it out to everybody and taking a piece of the action. And Steve Jobs always said, we've got to control the entire environment so that if we develop something, it will work well in every one of our machines. Whereas if you take PowerPoint, it doesn't work on an HP like it does on a Dell, like it does on other Microsoft computers. Everything looks a little bit different. And so in the short run, the Microsoft strategy worked out very well, and some would argue it continues to work well, although that company hasn't really grown in a long, long time, and Ballmer just left. Whereas Jobs obviously worked, and then he applied that really to his biggest home run, which was the iPod, iPhone, iTunes. So everything he controls, and so everything he knows works, and that's what has made Apple successful, whereas a lot of the other ones failed. So strategy really is a long-term focus. You got to take a few hits along the way in order to execute. And do you really have a differentiating position? The Microsoft operating system was a really good operating system. What made Microsoft wasn't the operating system, however, was one stroke of genius that I will give Microsoft credit for, which back in my day, we had Word, we had Harvard Graphics, and we had Lotus 1-2-3 for spreadsheets. And none of them spoke to each other. Whereas Microsoft integrated Microsoft Office. They had Excel and PowerPoint and Word, and you could take a graphic that you made from Excel and put it into a PowerPoint presentation. And it was a quantum leap, and that's how Microsoft really took off. So did it have a differentiating position? Harvard Graphics was a great system. Probably nobody in this room has ever heard of Harvard Graphics, maybe Steve. But nobody ever uses that. I suspect that one's out of business. Lotus 1-2-3, I don't think that one's operating anymore. Lotus operated for a while. And the good news is, for people like me who had learned how to do Lotus 1-2-3, Excel just kept all the same formulas. They developed their own formulas, but if you plugged in a Lotus 1-2-3 formula because that's what you knew, it still worked. It was genius. So easy adoption curve. And so all these things work seamlessly, and they work very well together. But Microsoft really hasn't innovated, in my opinion, since then. They came out with all these different operating systems, but they don't function as well as the Apple operating system. Apple has its quirks, but eventually comes around. You do have to have sort of a unique selling proposition. So if you're marketing something and it isn't unique in some way, it's just a commodity and you're doomed to fail. And for sure, price is not going to be a sustainable difference. And eventually people will figure out that there is a point in time where competing on price just doesn't make any sense anymore. So if you buy anything, if you buy electronic, you'll find the same price at Best Buy versus almost any other electronic outlet within $1 or $2. Because for a long time, they would compete on price. And this was something that pharmacy did, in my opinion, that hurt pharmacy back, in my day, so the late 70s, early 80s. It was the dumbest thing ever in pharmacy. So this was at the advent of copays. In my day, most people were still cash paying patients. When I was an intern, probably 50% of the business was cash and 50% was some sort of copay, including Medicaid. And some genius had the great idea, so instead of charging somebody $3 for a copay, they was charged $2.69. And patients would move for that 31 cents. So what would people do? People would discount it down to $2.50. And so it ended up this price spiral. Just to get people in, it went from $3 copay to like $1.69 was the low. But then the insurance companies got smart and say, well, if you don't need $3 to make a profit, you can get by for $1.79. The copay just went from $3 to $1.79. We're going to negotiate. You're just all going to get $1.79. And so pharmacy unfortunately learned that playing down this price game just doesn't make a lot of sense. And that's why company after company after company has gone out of business. Back at one time I was in charge of trade for Merck. So all pharmacies and all wholesalers. And there was this company called Foxmeyer that was a wholesaler actually based in Ohio, down by Columbus. And the president of Foxmeyer was telling me the story one time where he was in Chicago and he was running a wholesaler in Chicago. And there was another wholesaler in Chicago, Bergen or somebody. And all the hospitals in Chicago united. It was split about 50-50 in the business between these two wholesalers. And all the hospitals said, okay, we're just going to have one bid go out. The lowest bidder gets 100% of the business. So he undercut the other guy because it was only his way to compete. He was a small wholesaler. The other was a big wholesaler. And then after he won the bid, the hospital said, boy, it's going to be a lot of hassle to change our system. So they went back to the group that lost the bid, and they said, if you just match the price, we'll keep all our business with you. So 100% of the business went down to the floor of the price, but neither gained any kind of volume. So all they did was, he ran his first business out of business. He ran the first wholesale out of business. So when Foxmeyer was having problems back in '95, I guess they were having problems, they came to me and said, I need a little bit more time. And I'm like, look, man, you already convinced me to not trust you to give any more time because you didn't know how to operate the business. And then so Merck cut him off, and then they did go bankrupt. But it was all because he was still of this mindset to compete on price. So I think Apple is just brilliant from strategy perspective. HP bought Compaq, which was one of the great mistakes that HP ever made, and tried to get in the computer business. But they were competing with Dell, and they were competing with all these other people. Whereas, and Dell was always at a better price, so HP had no unique selling proposition. And in the worst, and Jeff, you can point to yours, how many people have a BlackBerry in this room? Nobody. This is the death spiral. So 10 years ago, BlackBerry's market cap was like, the company was worth $50 billion. Today it's worth, somebody offered $4.5 billion for the company. And yesterday or the day before, they announced that they're going to take another charge, another write-off of $400 million this year. This company's gone, but 10 years ago, they were state-of-the-art. After 9/11, everybody used a BlackBerry because it was the only thing that worked. But now, nobody uses it. Well, Jeff does. How many people have an iPhone? Yeah, see? And the rest probably all have Android. So it's down to those two. So BlackBerry's done. BlackBerry is like the buggy whip makers. The buggy whip makers tried to keep on, making those buggy whips and making a profit when everybody was moving towards cars. It's gone. BlackBerry is just going to be non-existent 5 years from now. And they just made the wrong strategy. They relied upon what they had as opposed to innovate. And hopefully Apple continues to innovate. Where are we on time?
Yeah, 10, 12 minutes.
Branding should always be instantly recognizable. So Epanova, which was our drug at Umthera, just got approved by the FDA as our brand name, which was great because I had branded every study we did with the name Epanova. So if the FDA would have rejected all the studies I did, would have said Epanova, and it wouldn't have been consistent with the brand name. I used to charge people when Merck came out with the 4S study. Everybody called it the 4S study as opposed to the Simvastatin or Scandinavian survival study. So when we came out with the heart protection study, when I was running Zocor, I used to have this jar in every meeting room and said, anybody who calls this HPS as opposed to heart protection study with Zocor puts $10 into the jar. It's the fastest way to get everybody to say it's always heart protection study with Zocor 40 milligrams. You got to have branding on everything you do. Even, I was doing some consulting a month or so ago, and the presentation these guys were using was inconsistent with the corporate presentation. It's like, all these things are branding. Everything you do is branding, and it's got to be consistent. So Steve Jobs was the best at that. This was his brand. This was his personal brand. Every time you saw Steve Jobs, and did anybody read the autobiography, or not autobiography, the biography of Steve Jobs? Another thing you do in your spare time. It's a great book. But everything he did was this black turtleneck, these jeans, and New Balance sneakers. And he got that idea from a trip to Japan. They had a corporate uniform in this computer company he was at in Japan. And he came back to the Apple executives and they said, well, we're not going to let you brand, you're not going to have uniforms. It's not going to be like a grade school where everybody's going into Apple with uniforms. But he thought it would be cool for him. So every time he was ever on stage, he was always in this black turtleneck. And the guy who wrote the book, I forget his name right now, said one time he went to Steve Jobs' house and went into the closet, and there were 100 of these black turtlenecks. Everything he ever wore, which kept it really simple. In order, this is sort of my look now. When I used to present at Merck, I always had a golf vest on top of it. But every time, you go into my closet, they're all a little bit different, but there's probably, I don't know, 100 golf shirts in there. And I don't wear anything but golf shirts. But this was, the moment you saw a black turtleneck and jeans, you knew it was Steve Jobs, even if you didn't see the face. This is a buddy of mine. We actually belonged to Trump's course in New Jersey when we lived in New Jersey. And I got to know Donald pretty well. He's actually a very interesting guy. He's a very generous guy. I just played golf at a charity tournament on Monday down in Florida. We live down in the Orlando area. And he donated everything. He donated his course, donated the caddy fees, donated everything, and all went to charity. And then we played, a fee to go in. But this hair is his branding. You see that hair? Nobody else is stupid enough to wear hair like that. This is really Donald. This is what it is real hair. This was at some other thing that Donald was speaking at a golf tournament we were at. But if you see this hair, you know it's Trump. And it's part of his branding. Everything he does is, the "you're fired" he trademarked. Everything he does is branding. And even you walk into one of his clubhouses, they all have the gaudy, glitzy look of Donald Trump. But he's a master of seeing things. Not only just in terms of a strategic vision, and he's made a lot of mistakes. I mean, he's lost a lot of money in Atlantic City and other places. But my locker used to be between me and you from his locker, and at the golf course. And there was one time I walked in there, and there was a bubble in the carpet. It just sort of bubbles up a little bit. And then, for whatever reason, the maintenance guy thought that he only should paint up, repaint. Donald repainted the locker room like every 6 months, so it looked great. But it was always the same color. But the guy repainted only as high as the easy ladder would reach, as opposed to all the way up. And you could tell, one was a little bit cleaner than the other. And I went to the locker room guy and I said, "Danny, what is this guy thinking? This bubble right by Donald's thing," and even though Donald doesn't take the back steps, if Donald ever saw the paint job, if I picked it out, Donald's going to pick it out. Sure enough, the next day, Donald came in, saw the carpet, the guy was fired. Because Donald is a master of execution. Everything's got to be flawless. And you're going to get fired if it's not flawless. And then the baby for E-Trade is one of my favorites. Budweiser, I don't really drink Budweiser, but the Clydesdales are their branding. And even Porsche, this is the Porsche key. If you don't have one now, hopefully at some point in time you do. It doesn't show up really cool, but the key is in the shape of a Porsche car. My son and I went over to the Porsche Museum in Stuttgart 2 years ago. And every car that they've ever produced since the 1940s has essentially the same shape. And the key is in the Porsche shape. So even down to, and even this little thing like this hood ornament, I don't know if you can see it here. And even the hood ornament is there. So it's brilliant branding. At least I as a marketer appreciate that. This was a campaign that we did a long time ago with Dan Reeves. Dan was head coach of Atlanta Falcons. And he coached in the '99 Super Bowl 4 weeks after he had quadruple bypass. So it made all the news, and man, nothing is sacred. I knew when Bill Clinton was placed on Zocor when it never leaked out for 2 or 3 years, but I knew within a day that Bill Clinton was put on Zocor back in '98, I guess it was. And I knew within a day that Dan was put on Zocor. And so we reached out to his agent, and Dan became our sports person. How much time have I got? 5. So from an execution perspective, well, you can do a lot if you just keep it simple. If you have too complex of an execution, it's probably not going to work. But you do need accurate and timely measurement. And probably my biggest problem with the government is even though everything points to it being a mistake, this path that they go down, they keep on going down this path because they don't feel like they've got to change. If you were looking at some of the government programs they've done over here, nobody in the private sector would ever continue to fund these things. They would just abandon these things because they haven't worked. But they're not measuring them. They just assume they worked, or they assume that they can't, take them away. But you've got to measure. You've got to see. I always knew what my return on investment was. When we did the Dan Reeves campaign, the first week it came out, it was 7/10 of a market share gain. That 7/10 in those days was worth $80 million in just a week of that campaign. Dan one time was talking to me, he's like, man, the worst part about being a head football coach in the NFL is every Monday morning you've got to put up with all the press, second-guessing things you did during the last week in the game. And he's like, you probably can't appreciate this. I said, are you kidding me? Every week the analysts report weekly RX activity and share activity for Zocor, and I get a call from the CEO. So same thing, you always look at how the results are. You take advantage of opportunities, like I said, the Pepsi thing versus Zantac. And I really don't think if the strategies are being successful, there's no reason to change. This is West Point, they are critical for execution. And if you talk to people who came out of West Point, it's a great training ground. The CEO of J&J is a friend of mine, came from West Point, and he's a master of execution and a master of strategic execution as well. In 1979, the Super Bowl commercial came out with Mean Joe Green, and it comes out about every time of the Super Bowl. Who knows what the product was? Coke, yeah. So Mean Joe Green tosses his shirt to this little kid, and it was Coke. Now, I actually know the marketer who did that commercial. His name was Sergio Zyman, and I was talking to Sergio about 10 years after this came out. This commercial was only on air for like 3 weeks because Sergio didn't think it worked. He didn't think that people remembered it for Coke. And here we are, you guys weren't even born when this commercial came out. And people remember this commercial as a Coke. They did a TV movie about this commercial. So Sergio, in my mind, is the worst marketer of all time because he abandoned the best marketing campaign of all time. It was a brilliant commercial. Almost every year it's still named the best commercial of all time, and Sergio pulled it after 3 weeks. I don't know what he saw. Important for you guys, every interaction is a chance to gain or lose a customer. It always bothers me when pharmacists talk about, oh gee, this is a very expensive medication and those bastards in the pharmaceutical industry are just, profiteers. The impression that the customer makes is this pill isn't worth it. In my mind, you should always talk about how valuable these medications are and how much they can change people's lives. We did a cost economic analysis for Zocor for everybody with pre-existing heart disease or high risk for cardiovascular disease, which was probably 80 or 90% of Zocor use. It was maximum 1 penny net cost per day. We take out savings of hospitalization and sick days and everything else. And anybody with diabetic who fit those criteria, it was a cost savings of $1 a day. But all I ever heard was the patient complaints of how expensive it was on a daily basis. People will pay, whatever a pack of cigarettes are right now, $5, what are they, $6 a pack? They'll pay that to kill themselves, but they wouldn't pay $3 or $4 for Zocor every day to save their lives. And so you guys have a chance to shape how people see medicine, because I think one of the biggest problems of non-compliance with therapy is people don't recognize that this therapy is very valuable, because everybody's complaining about the price, and pharmacists will echo that it's a very expensive product. And also from a pharmacy perspective, you want those people coming back and getting their refills. So I think it's an opportunity to talk about the value. I played golf in this golf outing with a guy who has autism, and it was funding for autism, so I funded it. And his son has autism. And Merck, even to this day, is $8 billion a year in R&D. And they haven't had a new successful drug since Januvia, which I think came out in 2004, 2005. So how you keep on spending $8 billion a year? And one time I was talking to the CEO of Walmart. We were named most, or preferred vendor or something, or vendor of the year for Walmart. And he was always complaining that our profit margins at Merck were so much better than their profit margins. And I told him, I said, anytime you put up a store, you can pretty much guarantee somebody's going to come into Walmart. If we put $1.5 billion into a drug, we have no guarantee whether or not that drug is ever going to hit the market and ever going to recoup $1, one patient ever going to see it. So when you think about the industry, look at the investment that's being made and how you've got to recoup these investments. And the FDA gets in the way of stuff. My son has type 1 diabetes, and so the rest of my life I'm probably going to be focused on type 1 diabetes. When you look at the investment over the years in type 1 diabetes and how much money has been spent, and all we still really have is better pumps. But there was just a new continuous glucose monitor approved by the FDA last Friday that is a dramatic improvement over the existing one, which my son hates. It's been available in Europe for 4 years. What could the FDA possibly learn in that 4-year period of time that you didn't gather by having it in Europe for 4 years? And oh, by the way, it's just a monitor. If you're low or high, you test yourself again before you give your
self-ending medicine. And the FDA gets in the way of progress. You know, even in clinical trials, they get in the way, which is why you do a lot of these early clinical trials in other parts of the world before you do them here. You know, the FDA, it's a fine line between, you know, being productive or counterproductive, and the FDA has swung the pendulum post-Vioxx into, you know, far into the counterproductive. And if you talk to device manufacturers, you know, device manufacturer approval times are way worse than drugs. So we're putting up barriers to stuff that we don't need to put in. Am I out of time?
You're pretty darn close.
So, and you know, the last thing I'd say is, you know, treat everything like it's your own business, whether you're working in a hospital, working in retail, or, you know, the best advice I ever got from Merck is, you know, we had this curmudgeon regional director when I joined Merck, and he said, you know, Wisler, as long as you treat every dollar like it's your own dollar, you'll be fine. It's the guys who, you know, like I was telling somebody the other day, you know, when I got to a certain level within Merck, I could take the corporate helicopter, I could take the more corporate jet and all these other things at any time I wanted. But, you know, the company get charged every time I was, and it didn't, you know, it took me an hour to drive up to White House Station. If I took the helicopter, it was 50 minutes. It wasn't worth, you know, my effort to go do all the helicopter stuff, and plus I'm cheap as hell. If you ask my wife, we'd know that I never really change anything. To me, spending money on a corporate helicopter just to save 10 minutes never made sense. So everything should be, you know, treat every nickel like it's your own nickel, even if it's somebody else's nickel. I think it would get some of these companies in trouble. I mean, when I was running Zopa, we had a $220 million a year promotional budget, but I knew every line item on that budget. And most of my colleagues that had, you know, maybe a $50 million budget didn't know the lines. You know, didn't know what each item was spending. And sometimes, even their biggest thing, I'd say, well, why are you spending money on this? And they're like, how much are we spending there? So you don't know what you're spending and how you're spending it, and then if you're not tracking to see how it's going to work. But everything should be, you know, you'll make your employers a lot happier if you treat it like it's your own money and your own business. Take some ownership. So I think entrepreneurship, the biggest thing is high potential reward, but a lot of risk and takes a lot of work. So I'll leave it at that.
Great. Will you stick around for a little while?
I will. Yeah.
Thank you. If you have questions, come on down here and talk to Mr. Wisler afterwards.
Good.